I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Rob, this is take number.
I don't know. I have to preface this because Lee and I have had sort of a comedy of errors with this podcast. I don't know, this is like the fifth time we've tried to do it?
Well, this is the fifth time we tried to do it, and then last Friday you had a babysitting issue.
Yes. My wife and my son were stuck somewhere and it was pouring rain, and my wife hadn't brought any rain gear.
And then there was that other thing. I was talking about the other babysitting issue.
What was the other babysitting issue?
Your wife had to tutor someone, and so you had to stay and cover.
Right.
We've had two babysitting issues interfere with this one podcast.
Yep. So that was it. And then, but even when we successfully sat down and tried to do this, there were technical issues. Well, I shouldn't say there were technical issues.
Rob was the technical issue.
I was the technical issue. Like 3 different times, I would look up and go, "Oh man, I'm not doing this thing. We're not recording." Like 10 minutes into the podcast.
Wow.
Yeah, exactly. So here's hoping that 6 times a charm?
I think so, yeah.
Something like that?
You know, in all honesty, I think it really works with this subject because today we're looking at the Book of Swindles, so it only makes sense that we've been swindled by life in trying to record this podcast, right?
Well, it almost doesn't work because the first couple of times it was my own fault, so it's not really life.
Swindled by Rob's stupidity?
I don't know. That so often happens in so many places. But we are talking today about the Book of Swindles by Zhang Yingyu, 17th century Ming Dynasty writer.
So when you say 17th century, late Ming?
Late Ming, yeah.
Okay.
We're working off of a recently published translation by Christopher Ray and Bruce Rusk through Columbia Press. It speaks well. We're going to get into this in a second, but this is a really superb translation. I was very impressed reading this. And it's a lot of fun, too, because you know, a lot of serious scholars in the China field tend to translate what we think of as, you know, highbrow. Yeah, well, you say boring. Highbrow, it comes to the same thing in a lot of places. You know, like 900-page academic treatises, things like that.
It's stuff, and I say boring, it's stuff that's very hard to teach.
Yes. This is really the opposite.
Yeah.
This is, I'm going to go ahead and say this is sort of like the Ming Dynasty version of Ocean's 11 or The Great Train Robbery. One of those classic sort of not true crime stories, but you know those stories where you're pulling for the bad guy, like you want to see how the thief gets away with it, you know? And so the stories in here really are, and I mean this as a compliment, a lot of fun. Not something you usually associate with ancient China, you know? I mean, you should, but
I think that's a stereotype that we are trying to address.
Yes,
because there's a lot about earlier Chinese literature that's really freaking fun.
Agreed. But you know, we talk about this a lot in our moments of geeking out when we're not on a microphone. But
as opposed to the moments of geeking out when we are on a
microphone, it's continuity of what we do anyway. But people think we prepare and study. We don't. This is just a continuation of our normal conversations. But
more alcohol involved.
A little bit. No, it depends on the day. But it is interesting that what gets taught in a lot of China studies classes are really the heavier,
the dry
weightier. Stuff. Not always dry. I mean, I wouldn't call Du-Fu dry for any stretch of the imagination. But the point simply being that what we're dealing with today, I would confidently give to either a group of scholars or just a group of undergrads encountering China for the first time.
In truth, you could give this to high school students.
You really
it's kind of
could. Fun. And not in it's simplistic and therefore not worth thinking about way, but in a way that makes it very interesting to handle for people who don't really know much about the field. So really exciting that they've come out with this.
Yeah.
And you know, we talked about it before, but in one of our
many
missteps in trying to do this podcast, but it's fascinating to me that this text, which was first written, not collated, this is Zhang Yingyu, he wrote these stories. He claims to have been collecting examples of crimes and swindles to warn the educated, civilized person how to not be robbed. But really,
it's just fun to watch them get robbed.
Really, he says it with a nudge and a wink. You're really reading this to figure out how it's done. But it was written in the 17th century, late Ming. And it's really not hard to follow. It's the same sort of We're still pulling for the bad guy. We still can't wait to see how they accomplish the bag drop or how they're going to steal someone's identity. It's the same sorts of things that make a series like Ocean's 11 work, too.
So why don't we go ahead and turn to maybe a short synopsis? It's a really short story, only a handful of pages.
Yeah, so there's... And I should mention this actually right before the synopsis. All the stories are fairly short, a page or two. The translators have put out a fairly slim volume in which they tried to take an example or two or three examples from each genre of crime, and Zhang Yu does organize them according to crime genre, right? And so we're looking at the crime type 3, money changing, and the story is called "A Taoist in a Boat Exchanges Some Gold." So the story is a really clever disguise story, I suppose you could say. And it involves a university student who is going to the Capitol with a friend. And his friend, the university student says, you can get some really nice gold in the Capitol. I think I'm going to do that. And his friend says, yeah, but usually you're swindled by moneylenders and people who give you a fake gold brick and you pay full price for it. So his friend goes with him to the Capitol just to make sure he doesn't get swindled. And sure enough, the university student does get a real gold brick. But the kid he buys it from, who was trying to swindle him and realizes he couldn't get away with it, goes back and tells his dad. And his dad says, well, that's not going to work. I'm going to go swindle them anyway. So the dad disguises himself as a Taoist priest and gets on the same boat as the students as they head back to school. And in the course of everybody talking on the boat, the student brags, hey, I managed to swindle the swindlers and I got a real gold brick. And everyone says, ooh, let's see it. He pulls it out and everybody handles it. And the priest says, wow, do you think I can take a look at it? And they hand it over to him. And in the darkness, unbeknownst to the students, he switches it out with the fake brick under his robes. And sure enough, the students get back and realize they've been had. Now, there's a lot of stuff that I think is really cool in this story. First, it gives you a little bait and switch. Like, oh my goodness, did the people who usually get swindled, did they actually pull one over on the swindlers? And he does in the beginning. Almost. And then things right themselves, and no, they're still...
By being wrong.
By being wrong. I also think it's funny that the guys getting swindled are university students. Can you think of any popular entertainment in history where university students were, like, clever and wise to the ways of the criminal world, and they're almost always weedy nerds who get stolen from or pushed around. Or
I think another interesting thing is the role that Taoism plays, or a Taoist priest. This isn't really dealing with like Taoism as a philosophical religious concept, right? This is just Taoists are kind of like greedy and dirty and bad guys as intermediaries.
Well, and it's funny because this is sort of it's a popular enough conception or misconception that it's all over Chinese popular.
It's everywhere.
Yeah, Pu Song Ling. There's a lot of stories in the Strange Tales from the Liao Jai or Jai Studio, dealing with weird, untrustworthy Taoists. A lot of Huabun have Taoists as really untrustworthy intermediaries.
We should mention, they're not just picking on Taoists. Buddhist monks are also considered like really kind of dangerous in terms of like don't let them in your house. Jinping Mei, the Plum in the Golden Vase, has several very dangerous Buddhist and Taoist characters who are just kind of running into the house. And in a lot of literature, Taoists are oftentimes having sex with the wives when they obviously shouldn't be doing that. That doesn't really happen here, but there's kind of Taoists are really tricksters.
Yeah, and it's funny actually because there's a lot of resonance with popular culture in the West like that. Like if you're watching a movie and a Catholic priest shows up, you're almost guaranteed that person's going to be a villain in some way.
When I was reading this, I was thinking about Chaucer. The monks coming through there, they're all really kind of nasty.
Yeah.
There's definitely a kind of corollary here.
Yeah.
I wanted to mention another corollary. You brought up Pu Song Ling. Pu Song Ling, this story is written before Pu Song Ling was writing, but it's just a couple of decades before Pu Song Ling. And it's interesting because it's structured entirely like Pu Song Ling, which both Pu Song Ling and Zhang Yingyu are drawing off of the same model. So we've discussed Pu Song Ling and we've discussed their model, which is Sima Qian. Everybody at this time is reading Sima Qian. So this is being presented as a kind of history.
Yeah.
It's interesting because, you have supposedly moral story that has it's a moral that's attached to the end. We see a moral kind of tacked on there, but we don't really believe that moral. There's kind of a sense of irony. There's a real sense of irony in both Pu Songling and Zhang Yingyu coming in here. So I thought that was really cool.
And this is how you're able to sell a story like this, because you could also probably have made a lot of cash just writing crime fiction like this, but when you package it as a history or a sort of a guide to civilized life, you get people to sort of play a role. Like they get to pretend to be educated and cultured, and at the same time they're transgressing that role. Like they get to play a double role, the good person and the bad person at the same time.
So I think there's a corollary here with modern day China too. I mean, so censorship is going on today in China, just as it was in the Ming Dynasty. Obviously, it's a different nature, but oftentimes, if you want to tell a story where the bad guy wins, you have to figure out a way to repackage it so that it's not, in a sense, praising the bad guy, if that makes sense.
Right.
There are tons of examples. I don't think we need to list them here, but there is this kind of, I don't know if it's the effect of censorship or just this kind of normative culture. So like the fact that there's so much power concentrated in the imperial house, and anything that makes them angry, you've got to make sure not to do. So by telling these stories where the bad guy wins, you repackage them so that they're kind of still fun, but then you're like, oh, here's the moral to that story. And it's not really the moral. Like, we don't really believe this book
we
is about.
We really don't believe Zhang Yingyu is a good-hearted civil servant who's simply trying to help people.
Because we're constantly trying to root for the bad guy. And every story in this collection, I think, most stories we're rooting for the bad guy.
And in most of the stories in the collection, this one included, the people being swindled are...
They deserve to get swindled.
Yeah, I mean, even if they're not bad people, they're certainly kind of ignorant or wealthy without deserving it. So if they do get robbed, like, and there's a couple of stories in the collection where somebody gets robbed, but they have so much money at the end they kind of chuckle at the cleverness of the thieves. See, there are only one or two examples in here where, as a reader, you're like, that is kind of messed up, man. I probably should not be happening. There's a story about cannibalism. There's a story involving rape. Like, both of those are a little troubling to read. Yeah. But the vast majority of these...
Rob was just like, yeah, go steal that stuff.
Yeah, well, you do. I mean, it is exactly... There's so many stories like this in history where you're not supposed to pull for the bad guy, but the way it's presented, the way it's packaged is so cleverly done that everyone wants to, right? Because there's a part of every one of us that wants to not have to live according to all the rules, but it's just not worth it, know?
And I guess this is my point. In a society like Ming Dynasty China, where censorship is rife, and in contemporary China, where censorship is, the hand of the censor is very heavy, I think that's even more the case. You really feel like breaking the rules. There's kind of a risque taboo that makes breaking the rules fun.
Sure. I mean, that's why... one of my very favorite contemporary Chinese writers, Yan Lianke, he came to prominence in the 80s with a story just called Serve the People, Wei Ren Min Fu Yu.
That's a disturbing story that we need to do.
We might end up doing it. But it involves using Maoist icons as sexual fetishes.
Yeah.
And when it first came out in a literary journal in the 80s, the journal flew off the shelves. I think they ended up selling like 200-something thousand copies.
That's a huge number.
Before the government was like, wait a minute, why is this magazine selling so many copies? And then they got it and immediately shut it down. But everybody was like, oh my gosh, I gotta read this. I'm not supposed to do this, know? The difference there, though, is that story was published very much as a really ruthless satire. This is presented as...
It's not really a satire.
This is like wholesome education with a nudge and a wink. Like, everyone knows really what they're reading, but in order to make it work, you have to buy into the packaging as well, which is really clever.
I think there's something, to go back to Sima Qian, there's something like this going on in the biography of Shang Yu that we talked about. Shang Yu is the bad guy. sort of.
Yeah.
But we love him. He's the hero of that story. But in the end, Sima Qian goes, oh, but he's the bad guy. And now we have a great emperor on our throne, and that emperor is descended from a guy who killed Xiang Yu. But in our hearts, we're really cheering on Xiang Yu.
Yeah. Or like someone like Cao Cao from the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, who
that's a good example.
Who depending on who you talk to is a horrible, horrible person, but such a brilliant strategist. Like you kind of want to figure out what tricks they think of next. Yeah. And it is really fascinating to me that what we call procedural fiction, which is anything that has a kind of a roadmap, right? So detective fiction, a lot of science fiction. If it's an alien invasion story, you kind of know what's going to happen. And this was very much a procedural collection. In fact, it was classified as a jing, like a classic of this genre. So this I guess it would make Zhang Yu a little bit like the Sir Arthur Conan Doyle of the late Ming Dynasty, sort of the Sherlock Holmes, that the archetype of the genre,
or the Sima Qian of crime fiction.
Yeah, and it really. There's a lot we have said and could say about it, but really what it is it's incredibly enjoyable, and I can't say enough how interesting I think it is that these crimes are so old and yet so much fun to read about. They've even got the really clever sort of arcane terminology. Like there's a section where a judge says, "Aha, you've been taken in by the old," I forget the exact title, the something or other crime, ruse, as though you're dealing with this secretive underground of thieves and criminals who
that has its own
vocabulary and secret tricks and stuff like that, because everyone wants to get in on that,
Any final thoughts, Rob?
Just read it. Buy it. Find a library. I know this sounds like a shameless commercial plug.
It is a shameless commercial plug.
It is really. Read this. I'm going to make my wife read it because I think she'd really enjoy it. But pick it up and read it. It really is a lot of fun to read, and there's a lot of culture in here that you wouldn't encounter otherwise.
Yeah, my final parting thought: avoid Taoist bearing advice.
Very good advice. Avoid Taoist bearing advice. Agreed.
And that's it. I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.